And so we come to the seemingly happy ending of Job. After all that's happened, the sudden arbitrary loss of his health, his wealth, his family, everything he cherished, from his argument with his so-called friends who claimed he had to have done something wrong, and he denied that over and over again, to his demand that God explain to him what the heck is going on. To God taking Job on a whirlwind tour, literally a whirlwind tour of creation. And we now come to this seemingly happy ending. The words we heard this morning, the book of Job ends with this restoration of his fortunes. Twice over, we're told. Twice as much as he had before. He's blessed with abundance and a community of family and friends who care for him. And we're told he has 7 new sons and 3 daughters. Daughters so beautiful, no one could compare to them in all the land. We're told he lived 140 years, saw his children and his children's children for 4 generations. Job died old and full of days. I love that. Old. That's how I want to die. Old and full of days. Basically, the biblical version of lived happily ever after. And I'll admit, I'm a sucker for happy endings. In fact, I'm invested in something ending well or good or happily, whatever I'm doing, whether it's reading a novel or watching a movie. I am really invested in that happy ending. I cannot, this is one of my pet peeves, I cannot stand for something to end badly. I even struggle with ambiguity. I want a happy ending. And I'll confess to you, I've been known to cheat a little bit if I'm reading a book and I'm reading it and I'm really getting invested and it looks like, uh-oh, I'll peek at the end. Just to make sure it was worth the time. I cannot stand unhappy endings. I don't know if it's my nature, I'm too optimistic, but I can't stand an unhappy ending. And the truth is, the 42nd chapter of Job seems to have stuck the landing, if you will. All is well for Job. All's well that ends well. But there is a part of me, a suspicious part of me, that I must confess that this ending feels a little contrived, a little bit of a cheat. Now, down south, one of my favorite phrases we have is putting lipstick on a pig, indicating trying to make something look more appealing than it really is. And the 42nd chapter of Job has a little bit of that lipstick on the pig, seemingly ignoring all the chapters before of Job's suffering experienced by him, the grief and pain he felt, questions and uncertainty, a truly epic struggle to understand his suffering. And the ending appears to kind of ignore all that. Now, if you remember, the first question posed at the beginning of Job in the heavenly councils is, would Job really love God if his prosperous life, his good life was taken from him? And the answer to that question is not really directly addressed, but it becomes apparent as the book unfolds that Job loves God profoundly, despite his suffering. And Job loves God enough to lament and complain and ultimately demand an answer from God. And God loves Job enough to show up and speak to Job. Now, one of the profound lessons of Job, I think for all of us, is that faith is not some Pollyannish, feel-good state of being, as it is a living, powerful, relationship that involves happiness and sadness, joy and sorrow, lamentation and praise, complaining and ultimately mutual accountability. You think about this, you don't really argue with someone unless you truly love them. You don't argue with people you don't care about. Maybe we ought to remember that sometimes our complaining and lamentation in a sense of holding mutual accountability and in our arguments and discussions these days are an act of love. A challenging act of love. But faith is that profound relationship with the one who created us and saves us and connects us all. So the answer is Job loves God enough to challenge God. But in the end, the question of why Job is suffering, is trying to make sense of that, is never really answered. Maybe it can't be in the world we live in. But the 42nd chapter tells us it ends with Job surrounded by his family and his friends. They're all gathered around him in his home, sharing bread and showing him sympathy and comfort. The answer to suffering is not some intellectual assertion. It is not some biblical explanation of why we suffer. The answer to suffering is it has to be shared and borne together for us to get through it. The good news of the last chapter is Job had someone who shared his sorrow and grief. Sometimes that's all we need. The other thing is Job is changed by his suffering. He gains a sense of wisdom of his journey through the pain and his conversations with God. He finds out he's part of something much larger than himself, something grace-filled and abundant, a creation, a cosmos, bigger than he could have ever imagined. His world is expanded and his perspective changed. There's a humility in finding out you're not the center of the universe. There is a sense, really, in learning that, a freedom you find in that. A truth that sets you free from fear and shame. It's all grace, God says. It's all grace, my brothers and sisters, my children. It's all a gift. So how is Job changed from that first few chapters of Job to this final chapter? If you remember, in those first chapters of Job, we're told about Job that he was really a very attentive religious person, almost a rigid religiosity about him. If you remember in the first chapter of Job, it tells the story of how he would make sacrifices every day just in case his children sinned. He's so religious, he makes sacrifices and religious observances just in case. But now, what happens in the 42nd chapter is there's this seeming carefreeness in Job, a sense, and the only way I can describe it is a sense of giddiness as we come to the end. And the way that's captured for me, if you remember in the first chapters, we are told about his sons and daughters, and yet we're not told their names. They remain nameless. But in the final chapter, it's obviously that we need to learn that the names of Job's 3 daughters is Dove, Cinnamon, and Horn of Eyeshadow. How bizarre. It's almost like he's some 60s guy naming his child Moonbeam or Peace Child. How odd those names jump out. Dove, Cinnamon, what the heck is Horn of Eyeshadow? But there's a sense of joy about that, a sense of celebration. There's almost so much silliness to it that it brings a smile to his lips and to ours. And then we're told, intentionally told, that Job gave an inheritance to his 3 daughters just as he did his son. Now, that may not seem too radical to us these days, but back then the sons could expect the inheritance and not the daughters. Grace abounds for Job. He's been transformed in his suffering to embrace the gift of life and joy. Now, these days, this is not simply a philosophical discussion for us these days. This isn't simply a theological wrestling that we're trying to come to terms with. These days, we're struggling. We're suffering. So many deaths, so many that are ill, so much confusion and uncertainty. The normal everydayness has been stripped from us in ways that feel definitely like loss. And yet, the promise of Job to me, that the wisdom we may gain in the midst of this suffering will lead to joy and grace. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.